Good morning to our friends in Canada and the United States. Good evening to all our other friends in Asia, in India particularly, Southeast Asia, and a very warm welcome. And especially to our speakers for today and our chair for today, which is Dr. Roma Bhattacharya. Dr. Julie Mehta will present her keynote address today, followed by Associate Professor Shoshana Gans from Memorial University in Canada, who will present a plenary lecture, to be followed by a presentation by Zifan Yang, an MA student from Stanford University in California. And the last paper for the day would be by Ananya Bhaumik, who has an MPhil degree holder from Jadavpur University and a long-standing member of that university's Center for Canadian Studies, which is a part of their comparative literature department, which has a lot to do with Canada. Their scholars are constantly visiting Canada, researching First Nations, keeping close contact with Canadian professors and students, and they've got a regular stream of visitors both sides. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And yesterday, in just a sentence, we had the first day of our conference where our keynote address was delivered by Professor Sheng Mei Ma, Professor of English at Michigan State University. Then we had a presentation by Associate Professor Chitra Nair from Government Sanskrit College in the University of Kerala. Then we had a presentation by Ms. Snigdha Mishra, who's an MPhil research scholar at the University of Hyderabad. And finally, a paper by Vivian Taylor, who's a recent MA graduate in cultural studies from the Claremont Graduate University in California. So just with those brief comments, I shall introduce our chair for this evening. Dr. Roma Bhattacharya holds a PhD from Oxford University, where she researched discourses of religio-political resistance to state authority in Elizabethan drama in the context of 16th century European intellectual history at the Faculty of English, Language and Literature, 1991 to 1997. Since 1999, she has worked at the United Nations at a leadership level, at headquarters and abroad. She has contributed significantly towards pioneering, influencing, and shaping United Nations global policy and institutional standards in cutting-edge areas such as women, peace, and security within an international development paradigm. So with those brief words, I hand the evening over to Dr. Roma Bhattacharya to conduct proceedings.
Thank you, Professor Mehta, for that kind introduction. Good evening, good morning to all our distinguished speakers, participants, and members of the audience. We have a very exciting evening ahead with scintillating papers, excoriating what it seems to me are different facets of diasporic discursive silences and literature's attempts to voice and refashion those silences. Without any ado, it is my great privilege to introduce our eminent keynote speaker, Professor Julie Banerjee Mehta. Julie Banerjee Mehta holds MA and PhD degrees in English literature and South Asian studies from the University of Toronto. A specialist in diasporic and post-colonial studies, she conceptualized and taught the Chancellor Emerita Vivian Poy Endowed course on Asian literatures and cultures in Canada at the Department of English, University of Toronto. Her translation of Tagore's play, Dark Core Post Office, was performed by Pleiades Theatre Toronto in 2010 to critical acclaim. She was adjudged one of the 16 most influential South Asians in Canada. She is the author of Dance of Life, The Mythology, History, and Politics of Cambodian Culture, and co-author of the best-selling biography of Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen. Her recent major publications include Toronto's Multicultural Tongues, Stories of South Asian Cuisines in Edible Histories, Cultural Politics Towards a Canadian Food History, University of Toronto Press, 2012. A selection of her book chapters include Narrating Race Asia, Transnationalism, Social Change, Amsterdam, New York, Rodopi, 2011. Asia, the Literatures and Englishes, Volume 1, from the Inside Singapore Ethos Books, 2007. Tonight, her talk is entitled Joy Kogawa's Obasan and the Global Biopolitics of the Brutalized Body, where among many things she will poignantly address, I quote, the body of citizens that are precariously located on the border of citizenship and outsider, unquote. Professor Banerjee Mehta, it is a great honor. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Roma Bhattacharya. This has been a singular introduction of, I think I'm overwhelmed. Thank you so very much for those kind words. A few minutes ago, while I was looking at the lineup of today's presenters, I was really chuffed, as I was telling you, to find that all four of us make up a kind of Canadian mafia. Professor Shoshana Gans from Memorial University, Sifan Young, until very recently, with the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto, Ananda Bhomik, a wonderful product with an MA and MPhil from the Center for Canadian Studies at Jadavpur University's Comparative Literature Department, and there's me, University of Toronto. So I'm speaking to you about the Japanese internment in Canada, resurrecting histories from bodies of silence. Some of you are familiar with the book, and I'm thrilled that Vivek, Krishna, and Anju Munshi are here, who are very familiar with the history of Obasan. We did it in the Bengal Club Historic Book Club. And there are many students here of mine, as well as scholars, who know the story and the tribulations behind Joy Kogawa's work. The project excavates the suppressed horror of how the Canadian state terrorized and was responsible for the death of their own Japanese Canadian citizens during the Japanese internment through the Second World War, and how Japan othered, shunned, stigmatized Japanese Canadians who were victims of the nuclear bomb while they were caught between worlds, between Japan and coming back to Canada during the war, as represented in the fictional work, particularly Obasan, by celebrated Japanese Canadian poet and novelist Joy Kogawa. What problematizes this exploration is that Kogawa and her younger follower, celebrated novelist and activist Keri Sakamoto, are women and activists in their fiction and life. Their narratives drag the shame felt by both the once self-censored victim and the errant perpetrator, the state, to a global court of readers, you and I, who are learning about the atrocities of dispossession of self-identity and belonging, that have yet, I think, to find restoration and restitution in Canada. The silent mother is a disturbing corporeality that registers its presence as a very subversive force in these tellings. Most historians would agree that in this exploration, the body becomes the landscape of the sacred and the profane, the arena on which history is unraveled. Unspeakable atrocities are located. By examining the trauma embedded in the bodies of the narratives of these three writers, this paper gives voice to the deafening silence that would not speak. My conversation today is a much distilled version of a larger excavation of a book that I'm working on the literature of the Japanese internment in Canada during the Second World War. In the preface to Obasan, Kogawa writes, and I quote, "There is a silence that cannot speak. There is a silence that will not speak. Beneath the grass, the speaking dreams. Beneath the dreams is a sensate sea. The speech that frees comes forth from that amniotic deep. To attend its voice, I can hear it say, is to embrace its absence. But alas, I fail the task. The word is stone." The critical scholarship on the fictional representation of the Japanese internment in Canada is complex and rich, though surprisingly, it's not abundant. There's almost no engagement in the scholarship of the critics on how Japanese Canadian writers address the representations of the treatment of Japanese Canadians who were caught between the worlds and were victims of the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Obasan, the lives of Japanese Canadians who are vehemently at stake in Japan, caught in Japan during the war, find little excavation by scholars. There are gaps, and I attempt here to fill some of those hollows, make some of the connections that I found missing. This interrogation is kind of new in the way it ferrets out the utter complexity of tellings, of egregious attempts of silencing Japanese Canadians in three ways. First, by the Anglo-Canadian state. Second, by Japanese patriarchy. But more fascinating, by Japanese Canadians themselves, who wanted to forget the ignominy, stigma, and shame of being reduced to the abject, decimated, dispossessed body. This project's contribution to the existing scholarship is that it draws Japan into the lexicon and attempts to examine the menace of how Japan othered its own, who were betrayed not just by Canada, but by their once motherland. I'd like to put us on the same page, and I do believe images do a lot for us to make history and literature become partners. Maybe I'd just bring to your attention that swift on the heels of Japan's entry into World War II, on December 7th, 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Canadians, citizens of Canada, were removed from the West Coast. The justification was military necessity for the corralling together of over 22,000 Canadian citizens who looked different. On September 22nd, 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney delivered an apology, announced an agreement which included symbolic individual redress payments of $21,000, just $21,000 for each living Japanese Canadian who had been expelled from the coast in 1942 or who were born before April 1st, 1949, when the war had well nigh ended. After that, 80 years after that brutalization of an entire community, in 2021, British Columbia offered a token recognition of the historical wrongs caused by the province when it helped to intern thousands of Japanese Canadians during the Second War, and announced the princely sum of 2 million for the Nikkei Seniors Healthcare and Housing Society. That's all that has come by way of an apology from the Canadian state to the Japanese community. So the Japanese internment, I just wanted to quickly go through these images of Japs, keep moving, Japs, get out of here. These were the pictures that caused communal shame to the entire community, because it is a huge investment of the self, of the entire communal identity of the Japanese people, who are very aware of national pride. And they were both Japanese and Canadian. We can't forget that. Moini, maybe we should go back to the earlier one. I missed that. Yes. So this is the picture I wanted to leave with you. This is a rare photograph of Joy Kogawa herself. Published in 1981, Oba-san really brought the issues to the fore, the historical blotches of the history of immigration in Canada. And Kogawa was 6 over here when the Canadian government confiscated her family's home. They were sent to an internment camp like thousands of Canadians. And this experience made her look back and write, in some ways, a memoir and a fictionalized account. And I'm thinking also of Snigdha's exploration yesterday of the genre of confessional writing. Mohini, we'll just show one more slide and we'll go on. Next one. So this is something I want you to keep in focus. It was an illuminating moment for me during teaching this novel in my class at the University of Toronto to 2 exchange students from Japan's Waseda University who expressed complete surprise to learn of the Japanese internment history through Oba-san, the novel that we were studying. They mentioned that this was the first time they'd heard about it, and that in Japanese schools or universities, this was never taught because there was a huge national shame that would be associated with it. That is why silence is such an important metaphor. It's a huge trope in the telling of the story of Oba-san. Thank you, Mohini. So in Oba-san, Joy Kogawa recalls her own story as a child. She remembers being dispossessed as a family where 22,000 Japanese were corralled just before the Second World War. And the trauma of the Hiroshima-Nagasaki bombings finds Naomi Nakasone stupefied, the protagonist in the novel, watching the bright rain sparkling as it fell on the clear glass windows of their Granton house, as Nakayama Sensei reads Naomi's grandmother Kato's letter of the P-29 bombings of March 9th, 1945, where Grandma Kato's sister, their mother, and her sister's husband were killed in a trice in the Hiroshima-Nagasaki bombings. Naomi's mother took on a vow of silence. I quote, "The horror would surely die sooner," they felt, if they refused to speak. But the silence and the constancy of the nightmare had become unbearable, unquote. And then again, in her letter, Grandma Kato apologizes for writing the horror. I quote, "The burden of the past, forgive me. It was Naomi's quest to know about her mother, a mother who had left before the Second World War and with whom there was any little contact during and after the war, a mother whom she hungered for, a mother who wanted to protect the child mind so fiercely, she had left instructions to Naomi's aunt, Oba-san, and Naomi and her brother Stephen's guardians never to divulge the nightmare of the atomic bombing which decimated her. Quote, "The tree is a dead tree in the middle of the prairies. I sit on its roots, still as a stone. In my dream, a small child sits with a wound on her knee. The wound on her knee is on the back of her skull. The child is forever unable to speak. The child forever fears to tell. Gentle mother, we were lost together in our silences. Our wordlessness was our mutual destruction." Once again, this invokes in my mind the beautiful correlation we got yesterday in Professor Shengmei Ma's presentation, where he talked about the primal wound. And when I was reading this before presenting this to you, I was thinking of this concept of, in my dream, a small child sits with a wound on her knee. The wound on her knee is on the back of her skull. The Freudian concept, which our keynote speaker yesterday, Professor Shengmei Ma, was talking about. As if it were not devastating enough to live in the violent cloud of silence that permeated the impossibility of contact with families which had gone to Japan and could not return to their home, and to their children in Canada as the war bludgeoned their hearts. In Canada, they were hauled out of their homes, separated from each other, flung into camps that were toilets of terror. No medical facilities, no privacy, freezing water, subhuman conditions of complete abjectness was their lot. In a meeting with Choi Kogawa some years ago, and remember, she's a poet first and a novelist second, these are the words she recited to me before she went on to speak about the internment and her poetry. And I quote, "Be willing to be torn apart. God is where the struggle is. Love is where the struggle is." Grandmother Kato's surprise, shock, and a kind of perilous relief in finding her daughter, Naomi Nakasoni's mother, in Nagasaki, physically mutilated by the bomb, is perhaps one of the most haunting descriptions in Obasan. At first unrecognizable, the disfiguration makes it impossible for Grandma Kato to find her daughter. It is her daughter, ironically, who finds her mother. One evening, I quote, when she, Grandmother Kato, had given up her search for the day, she sat down beside a naked woman she had seen earlier, who was aimlessly chipping wood to make a pyre on which to cremate a dead baby. The woman was utterly disfigured. Her nose and one cheek were almost gone. Great wounds and pustules covered her entire face and body. She was completely bald. She sat in a cloud of flies. Maggots wriggled among her wounds. As my grandmother watched her, the woman gave her a vacant gaze, then let out a cry. It was my mother. In an interview with me, when she was asked if Obasan is a cathartic walk at the University College in Toronto, she said, and I quote, "The action of the pen precedes the understanding that follows it. If catharsis happens, it is by chance. It is the work that is important. This story should be known, although it is very painful. If we deny the truth, we cannot be free. For the Japanese Canadian, redress to be felt and effective, the story of the community has to be told. In my life, I have been a truth seeker to others' detriment." In the 60s, when I was writing poetry, hacking up the mountains with a pickaxe, I had written a short story, Obasan. After the war, I lived in Coaldale, just like the character Stephen in my book. Then, in the late 70s, I had a very strange dream. In the dream, I was told to go to Ottawa and work in the archives. The article on Coaldale got accepted. Someone gave me a sheaf of papers. There was a young woman, Muriel, whom I met there, who was passionately upset. At the same time, the short story Obasan was being strengthened as I worked on it. Emily in Obasan is based on that character Muriel, and Granton in my book is really Coaldale. At the time, I was coming to terms with what happened to my mother. I find it very hard to speak. I find it impossible to come to terms with what happened to my mother. The name Nakane, I don't know where it came from. Suddenly I heard a man when I was in Los Angeles shouting in Chinatown where I was walking, "Joy, Joy, is it you?" It was Arthur Nakane. I knew him when I was in my 20s. Nakane is a rare name in Japan. Arthur had a brother, Stephen. Arthur and Stephen's mother had lived in Nagasaki. That's where my other book, Gently to Nagasaki, came from. And that's how I wrote what is now Obasan. Julia Krishneva's concept of powers of horror, along with the idea of the abject, something that is excreted, such as bodily fluids and blood, as an inherent part of the subject, both elaborate Kogawa's vision. The ultimate martyrdom of Christ and his transformation from flesh to spirit cannot be divorced from the palpability of his corporeal body with open weeping wounds. Thus, in the course of what happens to Naomi Nakane's mother's body in Nagasaki during the atomic bombing is continuously a point of reference, and her moment of epiphany holds in its space the imaginaire of a martyred Christ whose body is being received. And I quote from Obasan, "Martyr mother, you pilot your powerful voicelessness over the ocean. You wish to protect us with lies, but the camouflage does not hide your cries. Beneath the hiding, I'm there with you, mother, lost in the abandonment of your own homeland. You do not share the horror. Young mother, my mother at Nagasaki, am I not there with you?" Atomic bomb survivors are referred to in Japanese as hibakusha, which translates literally as bomb-affected people. According to the Atomic Bomb Survivors Relief Law, there are certain recognized categories of hibakusha, people exposed directly to the bomb and its immediate aftermath. People exposed within a 2-kilometer radius who entered the sphere of destruction within 2 weeks of the explosion. People exposed to radioactive fallout generally, and those exposed in utero, which mothers were pregnant and belonging to any of these defined categories. In another interview in my class at the University of Toronto, during a visit to the Chancellor Emerita Vivian Poy's course, Kogawa's younger version, Sensei, second-generation writer Keri Sakamoto, said that her parents were interred in the Japanese internment camp. It was a particularly traumatic experience. So what Kogawa really is exceptionally brilliant at doing is passing on the baton to the younger writers like Keri Sakamoto. Keri said to us, I quote, "My mother was only 15 and her brother died without any medical attention. He died unattended. Close inverted commas. Dr. Roma Bhattacharya, do I have another 5 minutes?
Not 5, actually. You have about 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, that's
okay.
fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I quote, "Their bodies were distended like the bodies of people who have drowned. Their faces were fat, enormously puffed. Their eyes were swollen shut. Skin around their eyes were crinkly and pink, hanging down from both arms like rags, gray-colored skin." Japan's sociocultural history has a pervading presence of the untouchable class, pockmarked with the abject outcast called burakamin in its highly stratified culture. Burakamin, in Japanese Hamlet people, also called eta, pollution-abundant outcast or untouchable, occupies the lowest levels of traditional Japanese society. Although the class was officially abolished in 1871, vast numbers of burakamin continue to live in ghetto-like communities throughout Japan. No official census exists, but about 6,000 segregated communities of burakamin contain a total population variously estimated between 100,000 to 1 million. The creation of another untouchable strata, hibokusha, seems an easy creation. The atomic bomb survivors are referred to in Japanese as hibokusha, which translates literally, as I said, to bomb-affected people. In Hiroshima, it was the body that was burned and bloated in the aftermath of the atomic bombings. Yoko Ota, who wrote Hiroshima, Three Witnesses, refers to how Japan laid claim to the bodies of its citizens during the Second World War. The body was at the center of the country's nationalistic discourse. The individual body, known as the nikutai, was seen as corporeal, was a foil with the kokutai, or the national body. The kokutai, the national body, became a fascist construct with the emperor at the top of the highly stratified society.
Professor Mehta, you have a minute, sorry.
And it morphed in the war years into a masculinist force that silenced any semblance of opposition or subversion. The bond that was forged between the macrocosm of the nation and the microcosm of the individual was envisaged as a necessary mirror to each other. Joy Kogawa meditated on this exclusionist, nationalist policy, whether it is in Japan or whether it is here in Canada. And it is Etienne Baliban or even Slavoj Žižek who point to this natural phenomenon of violence on the body that makes the human being disposable. The word is stone. If I could follow the stream down and down to the hidden voice, would I come at last to the freeing word? I ask the night sky, but the silence is steadfast. There is no reply. Only the brutalized body becomes the voice that speaks in silence. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Julie Banerjee Mehta, for that riveting talk and shining a light on different forms of poignant diasporic silences. We now turn to the plenary lecture brought to us by another distinguished speaker, Professor Shoshana Gans, and it is my great honor to introduce her. Shoshana Gans is an associate professor of Canadian literature at Grenfell Campus, Memorial University. In 2008, she co-edited a collection of essays with University of Ottawa Press on the poet Alperdi. In 2017, she published Eastern Encounters, Canadian Women's Writing About the East, 1867 to 1929, with National Taiwan University Press. So Shanna just completed a manuscript entitled Now I'm Become Death, Industry and Disease in Canadian and Japanese Literature. This book is currently being revised for McGill Queen's University Press. Tonight, Professor Ganz will speak to us this evening on the loneliness in between one word, negotiating hybrid and post-human identities in Genki Ferguson's Satellite Love. So it is with my great pleasure, Professor Ganz, to welcome you. The floor is yours. You have 20 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you for your introduction, and thank you to Dr. Julie Mehta and Dr. Harish Mehta for organizing this. And I do have a lot to say about Obasan as well, and I'm looking forward to making some connections in the discussion that follows. And the author I'm speaking about, Genki Ferguson, is not as well known as the author of Obasan, but hopefully this will be an introduction that will pique your interest in this author. The Japanese and Canadian author Genki Ferguson spent half of his childhood in his maternal homeland of Kyushu, Japan, the other half in his paternal land of birth, Canada. Ferguson's writing is thus informed by both his Japanese and Canadian heritage and upbringing, and an intimate understanding of the religious and familial complexities of being mixed-race Japanese and Canadian. Further, Ferguson shows the ways in which a variety of different characters use their hybridity to negotiate loneliness, bullying, and memory loss. Ferguson manages this feat of mixed positionalities in part through a post-human and Japanese literary aesthetic. This paper will examine the ways in which Genki Ferguson illuminates Shinto and Buddhist tradition for a global audience through his intimate understanding of those philosophies and practices. This paper likewise shows the ways in which Genki Ferguson, while writing mostly in English, uses a very quiet, simple, and utterly Japanese-feeling aesthetic in his writing. I will then examine how Ferguson shows particular insights into the loneliness of the human condition, as explained from perspectives of outsiders, or what could be viewed as the hybrid characters of the text. Thus, this paper will argue that Genki Ferguson employs post-human ideologies to decenter the liberal humanist and anthropocentric subjectivities of singular national identities, literatures, and indeed human exceptionality by employing a Japanese aesthetic to explain and illuminate the complexities of hybrid identities and cultures. In the process, Ferguson explains Japanese traditions and cultures for a global audience, and shows the problems of privileging humanist logic in the post-humanist context when shifting the status of human identity and technological relationships necessitate a new understanding of the in-betweenness of being. In this paper, I'm going to use the discussion of posthumanism by Carrie Wolf in What is Posthumanism and Rosie Brododi in The Posthuman as something of a theoretical and literary map for understanding and illuminating Genki Ferguson's literary practice and the imaginary world of satellite love. Thus, I will argue that Genki Ferguson's work is radically posthuman in its positioning of people with disabilities and mixed-race subjects, and in viewing imaginary friends and satellites assessing human characteristics, including emotional vulnerability, mortality, and a sense of self that has traditionally been reserved for the human. Moreover, the place itself, Sakita, is a small imagined city in southern Kyushu that is a post-industrial wasteland, suffering the consequences of a failed model of unlimited progress and potential. Genki Ferguson, in an online public talk as part of the English program's reading and lecture series at Grenfell Campus Memorial University in November 2021, shared his passion for Japanese literature, tracing in his own reading the significance of various traditional and contemporary Japanese voices to his own formation as a writer. The list was much what you would expect and included numerous Japanese authors well known to readers in English through translation. I introduced his reading and talk in part by suggesting that his work was very Japanese, so much so that I read at times under the illusion or feeling that I was reading a translation of a Japanese author into English. The work was so Japanese, in fact, that I put it on a Japanese literature and translation course. Genki Ferguson felt that this was a great compliment, as it was, to his style and the homage paid to his maternal birthright and the literature of Japan. Thus, conscious or not, and it matters little which, Genki Ferguson was emulating the great Japanese tradition of authors in both his style and content. What then characterized this very Japanese literary aesthetic, and how is hybridity of authorship and subject expressed in Satellite Love? Ruth Ozeki writes of Satellite Love that the work will leave you breathless, charmed, and deeply thoughtful. Ozeki, identified on the cover as being the author of A Tale for the Time Being, this in itself is an important identification of a connection between A Tale for the Time Being, Ruth Ozeki, and the author Genki Ferguson and his work of fiction, Satellite Love, something like the relationship between Joy Kagawa and Kari Sakamoto. Ruth Ozeki, like Genki Ferguson, is an author who is mixed-race Japanese and Canadian and explores hybrid subjects in a number of her works. While the text is identified on the cover of Satellite Love, is in fact Ruth Ozeki's third work of fiction, A Tale for the Time Being. Her previous two novels, All Over Creation and My Year of Meats, both have first-person, mixed-race Japanese American narrators and subjects. A Tale for the Time Being focuses on a young woman who moves back to Japan after spending much of her early childhood in the United States and faces extreme bullying by her schoolmates and neglect by her parents. Bullying due to race and neglect by parents is also central to Satellite Love. Anna's American father has left Japan, and her mother is mostly absent. Anna is the object of extreme bullying at school and has little support outside of school. As a result, she turns to her friends and falls in love with a satellite, going so far as to build a spaceship to join him. This makes her an outsider to the culture and her peer group. In both A Tale for the Time Being and Satellite Love, cultural aspects of Japan and Buddhism are explained for a Western audience. Thus, the author and the character act as translators of Japanese culture from both within and without. They have an intimate connection to both East and West and are able to understand and explain both, while at the same time standing outside of either, or in another way, and perhaps more accurately, standing in between. This could be compared to how the gods in Japan mediate between earth and heaven and dwell in a sense between both realms, making the outsiders in the culture both translators and, in a sense, mediums. However, while Ruth Ozeki's works have a very North American aesthetic and seem to view North American culture and consumerism from the perspective of Japan, the perspective and aesthetic of Satellite Love is very Japanese. The story is set in Japan. The narrators are all Japanese. Buddhism and Japanese words are explained at length. The food and cultural practices, smells and symbols are also all Japanese. While these are explained and translated for the Western and English reader, there is the feel of the culture and language being Japanese and in the process of being translated and explained for the Westerner. John T. Brinkman writes in Simplicity, a Distinctive Quality of Japanese Spirituality, that this work defines simplicity as the distinctive quality of Japanese spirituality. Brinkman goes on to give examples from ikebana, haiku, and a variety of other Japanese cultural expressions. Genki Ferguson's Satellite Love is part of this tradition of simplicity. The writing itself is simple, clear, and unadorned. There is not the clutter of words and objects or the long and ornate sentences inherited by English writers from the language and structure of Victorian and Edwardian British literature. Rather, the sentences in Satellite Love are short, direct, simple, and clear, reminiscent, as it were, of the careful, crafted, and simple images of the Japanese pictograph and the Japanese poetic tradition that inspired Western modernism with its direct treatment of subjects and lack of adornment. These are part of the bare and uncluttered Japanese aesthetic carefully employed in Satellite Love, and as the author has noted, the result of his study and emulation of Japanese literary form. Japan has historically been called the floating world. referring to the jewel-like drops of land suspended in the water and forming the archipelago of Japan. The last chapter of Murasaki Shikabu's The Tale of Genji is given the title Yume no Ukihashi, the Floating Bridge of Dreams, which according to Haruo Shirane, Genji refers to earlier in Usugumo, with the lines, "The affairs of men and women are like the floating bridge of dreams." One of the meanings elucidated by Haruo Shirane is the passage between this shore, Shigan, the world of impermanence and suffering, and the far shore, Higan, the land of enlightenment. Fujiwara no Teika's famous poem in the Shinko Kinshu, quoted by Shirane, "The Bridge of Dreams Floating on Spring Night," captures both nuances of the illusory connections between people and between this world and the next. This feeling of impermanence and the illusory connections between people and the floating bridge between this world and the next are connotations that are surely a part of satellite love, particularly in the final scenes when Anna seems to hover between this world and the next, and the tenuous connection between her and Soki. Another way of picturing this image of the floating world is through one of the most famous and beautiful scenes in Japan, the Utsukushima Shrine and its floating torii gate suspended in the water give the poignant sense of life being transient. The sakura or cherry blossoms are a ubiquitous symbol of Japanese life, the bright, brief, delicate color and fragrance of spring, part of the cyclical but impermanent moment that is life itself. The snow that falls early in the novel is another such symbol, particularly as the snow falls in Kyushu, a southern part of the archipelago that rarely sees snow, and when it does, the snow dusts the ground and then disappears. Like life and the seasons, Ferguson writes, light flecks of white were falling from the sky, just beginning to dust Sakita's rooftops. Anna notes that it hadn't snowed in Sakita for as long as I could remember. This sense of impermanence and floating pervades the novel, in part through the literal floating character of the satellite named Leo. Leo floats in the sky, looking down on Anna and Sakita, suspended between earth and sky, and later between real and unreal. Is he only in the mind of Anna, or has he become a real person? There's a pronounced quietness that pervades the text through the characters and setting. Anna is alone much of the time with no one to talk to, and so her thoughts and actions take place in a silence that is almost palpable. Leo, the satellite, is in a space that cannot hear what is going on Earth and is in a space literally void of sound. The grandfather, suffering from dementia, is confused and alone for much of the text. The general is deaf and doesn't speak, so there is no sound. Soki is new to town and spends time at the shrines alone, and so again there is silence around his character. The settings of empty rooftops, empty homes, deserted streets, abandoned industry, run-down and uninhabited shrines all contribute to a setting of silence and characters that are alone, lonely, and immersed in a mostly silent world. This quietness is peaceful and sometimes eerie, but very characteristic of the Western experience of Japan. In spite of the technology and the number of people on the archipelago, there is a distinct quality of quiet, and this is accurately captured in Satellite Love by creating a vacuum of quiet around the characters, who exist in literal or metaphoric spaces void of sound, or perhaps, like the shrines that Soki and Anna visit, emanating a kind of sacred quiet. Haruo Shirane in Japan and the Culture of the Four Seasons prefaces the work with the following: the ubiquity of nature in Japanese culture is difficult to overlook, even in today's urbanized technological age. Shirane goes on to say that nature appears not only in poetry and painting and traditional arts, but in many aspects of daily life. In fact, Shirane writes that almost every letter written in Japan begins with a reference to the current season, and so much more so in poems and fiction. Early in the first chapter of Satellite Love, the season is indicated by a crisp winter breeze that chased me through Sakita's urban maze. Eventually, the season is further established through the light flecks of white falling from the sky, just beginning to dust Sakita's rooftops. Most of the story takes place
Professor
within a
Gans,
few
you
weeks.
have 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes.
Okay. Between the end of the school term and New Year's Eve. The only exact date given is December 31st, but the Buddhist and Shinto New Year's practices are explained at length. Just as Shireen notes the ubiquity of nature, even in today's urbanized environment, Ferguson describes Sakita early in the text as a place where urban architecture met on even terms with rural landscape previously slated to be paved over. The remaining rural nature is the result of failed economic expansion, what Ferguson calls a place perpetually on the bust end of a boom and bust economy. When Soki goes in search of Kami and Sakita, he goes to a shrine on the outskirts of town near a partially empty mall. Soki notes the shrine really was beside the mall. There was a wall of trees right at the edge of the parking lot, which the shrine was supposed to be hidden behind, a hard border separating the city from nature. I could barely see the shrine tucked into the grove, but I caught a glimpse of red through the leaves. Thus, the city parking lot and mall are broken by a hard border of trees that separate the city from nature. This contrast between the empty city and nature associated with the sacred is emphasized by the border of trees. While Soki notes that they say that nature has spirits in it, the trees, stars, dirt, they all have kami inside, the city makes him wonder about technology and whether man-made objects have kami too. These questions raised by Soki about the nature of kami are, according to John T. Brinkman, part of the ambiguity of divine presence. Its lack of definition or defined category is part of the sustained and cultivated context of its direct experience. Brinkman contends that the elusive quality of the divine is apparent. While kami are part of the native tradition of Shinto and associated with shrines and shrine worship, there is a distinct lack of definition and an elusive quality to the kami that is expressed through Soki as an uncertainty about their presence and a further continually questioning and seeking for the divine that is the god kami at the Shinto shrine and in nature. It seems that technology complicates this relationship to kami, as originally they were associated with nature. The question that emerges in this text is whether man-made objects in fact have kami or gods in them. This question is answered in part by Jennifer Robertson when she writes in Robo Sapiens Japanicus that the expansion of Buddhist funerary rituals to include animal pets and valued objects and artifacts has a long history in Japan. In fact, in relation to robots, Masahiro Mori in The Buddha and the Robot argues that robots have the Buddha nature in them. That is the ability to attain Buddhahood. The historian of religion, Fabio Rambelli, in his book Buddhist Materiality, argues that the Japanese have developed a relationship with material culture, whereby objects play a role in the person's quest for enlightenment. This identification with objects is such that they cannot simply be thrown away, and thus the memorial service involves on-site cremation of burnable objects. The fire ritual pacifies, purifies, and liberates the indwelling spirit, kami, of a given thing, and ensures its repose and its human guardian solace. Thus, it would seem that the elusive quality of the gods or kami has remained elusive and yet defined as such and acknowledged within the nature tradition of Shinto is the presence of the kami. Also within the Buddhist quest for the Buddha nature is the acknowledgement of the indwelling spirit, kami. The presence of kami in all things is further emphasized in the funerary practices and rituals for objects. In fact, in Soki's search for the divine or spirit of kami in the urban wasteland of Sakita, he encounters Anna, who is in the process of creating and imbuing objects with life through the power of her belief. In fact, it seems that the belief in the life of things and the life of the spirit is more important than the objective truth, whether and if such a thing exists. In the Western context, there is a long tradition of seeking verifiable truth, but it seems that the elusive quality of kami in both Shinto tradition and Buddhist philosophy, through its very lack of definition, allows for the ongoing manifestation of spirit in an evolving technical age. Thought of in a different way and from the perspective of posthumanism, the sharp lines between human and others, whether animal or machine, have been broken down through an understanding of the complicated assemblages that make up all things. Thus, humans are in fact made up of many different molecules, amoeba, and other microscopic organisms, which work together to create thought, movement, and consciousness itself. Human and non-human assemblages undermine the position of human exceptionality and rather show the relationality of all things. Clearly, posthumanist thought echoes the pre-existing rituals and beliefs enacted in Buddhism and Shintoism, whereby human and non-human alike have the Buddha nature and as such an indwelling spirit or kami, and are part of material objects and systems found in humans. And I think I'm close to out of time. So I have 2.5 pages, short pages, which is about a paragraph. I print big. The question of consciousness is, however, far from resolved even from the perspective of posthumanism. Works such as Pentio Heikonen's Consciousness and Robot Sentience question why it is so hard to make computers to understand anything, and why it is equally hard to design sentient robots with the ability to behave sensibly in everyday situations and environments. While literature is full of examples of the consciousness of robots, Heikonen argues that machines still do not understand anything. However, Kathleen Richardson observes from her conversation with roboticists at MIT Robotic Labs and her analysis of cultural narratives about robots and AI machines that cultural narratives of robots and machines may point to distinctions, but AI, robotics, and computer scientists emphasize the similarities between humans and machines. They view the human as the machine. I'm just going to skip ahead to the second self. Turco gives in the second self many examples of ways in which humans are thinking machines and machines can think. And I'll bring this back to Genki Ferguson, who it would seem that, according to Genki Ferguson, it would seem that human thought can bring about the sentience of machines. While Ferguson does not seriously enter into any debate about consciousness, he does have characters who question their existence, their agency, and their independence from their creator. Can the machine know and think outside of what the programmer and maker has made the machine to do and know? And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gans, on provoking us to engage deeply with in-betweenness at so many different levels. We can engage more. You can bring in your points more in the question and answer session, and your fascinating insights into cross-cultural writing in English, but in an utterly Japanese feeling aesthetic. I think these have huge implications for the philosophy of language and for post-colonial literature. And of course, your absolutely cutting-edge analysis of the post-human. So we turn to our next speaker. Another thought-provoking speaker for this evening, Ms. Zifan Yang, graduate student, Stanford University. Zifan Yang received her undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto and began her MA program at Stanford University in the fall of 2022. Tonight, to speak to you on self-allegorization as a way of addressing these chasmic, diasporic, discursive silences, to speak on self-allegorization, the nature, possibilities, and limits in No No Boy, a 1957 novel written by Japanese-American writer John Okada. It is my great honor to invite Ms. Zifan Yang, Stanford University, to the table. Her paper is entitled Provocatively From Either Or to As Well As, Towards a Bildung Without the Build, Tracing the Rise and Fall of Self-Allegorization in No Boy, an Alternative Bildungsroman. Zifan, the mic is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Before discussing the novel, I would like to first discuss the concept of allegory and Bildungsroman, which is part of my title. So in Allegory and Ideology, Friedrich Jameson argues ideology as a kind of unconscious social mapping whereby the conscious and unconscious individual biological subject situates himself or herself within the collective social structure. Allegory operates as a fundamental mechanism in that process. Since Bildungsroman traces precisely the journey of an individual's integration into the broader society, we may then take the Bildungsroman as a proliferation of such a mechanism, allegory in its more obvious sense. In other words, as a narrative that articulates the function of allegory. In fact, while focusing on different case studies, scholars have all emphasized its allegorical aspect. For Bakhtin, Bildungsroman situates the growth of the individual in parallel with the development of the nation. For Moretti, Bildungsroman situates the compromises made by the individual youth in parallel with the contradictions of modernity. For St, the soil-nation allegory is an integrated part of Bildungsroman. Considering the above for scholars' discussion, we may then observe that allegory is approached as the product of the reader's reaction, or the author's design, or possibly both. In Jimson's word, every interpretation of a text is always proto-allegorical. In Estey's words, writers use strategies to expose the conventional element between person destiny and national eschatology. While building upon the existing definitions of allegory and Bildungsroman, my paper focused neither on the authorship nor the readership. Instead, I like to interpret the protagonist Ichiro himself as the reader and author of his own story. To elaborate, not only as the text itself is an allegory, the characters who live within the text also make allegories themselves. This paper would thus examine the allegory, the acts of self-allegorization in No No Boy, a 1957 novel written by John Okada. Such an examination thus also challenges the allegorical aspect of Bildungsroman, for the protagonist's sense of alienation is curiously brought by his very act of allegorization. The identical relationship he makes between individuals and nation-states. Meanwhile, his hope and reconciliation with self, family, and broader society are driven from a gradual abandonment of such a cognition. In other words, through gradually giving up the urge to categorize himself under the Japanese-American binary. In short, while pointing out the futility of self-allegorization in No No Boy, this paper does not read it as an LT Bildungsroman that completely negates the value of allegory. Instead, this paper argues that the constant negotiations Ichiro undergo with self, family, friends, and other acquaintances reveal that individuals are often too complex to be allegorized or represented under a specific framework. Moving on to the analysis of the novel itself. So at the beginning of the novel, Ichiro Yamada, a young Japanese-American man, returns home after spending 2 years in the federal prison for refusing to fight for America in World War II. At this point, he suffers from distress and self-resentment, and keeps asking himself why he did not join the army. He considers his mother to be entirely Japanese, his brother Taro to be wholly American, and himself a neither nor. Quote, "I'm not your son, I'm not Japanese, and I'm not American." What then operates as the backbone behind Ichiro's sense of shame and resentment? As Naoki Sakai argues in Two Negations, it is the omnipresence of the state in the life of the protagonist. For Sakai, at issue is not some authority called the state, but the fact that the novel's narrative is organized from such a particular point of view that as soon as any word is uttered, every character in the novel inevitably has to engage in some dialogue with the state. Sakai's emphasis on narrative and omnipresence thus offer further proof on why Ichiro's expressions should be read precisely as national allegory rather than a direct struggle against the state. Ichiro's inner monologue in Chapter 1 thus exemplifies the hierarchies and restrictiveness of self-allegorization. For instance, quote, "There was a time when I was your son and we were Japanese with Japanese feelings. Then there came a time when I was only half Japanese, because one is not born American and raising American without becoming American and loving it. But I did not love enough, for you are still half my mother and was thereby still half Japanese. And when the war came, they told me to fight for America. I was not strong enough to fight you. And it's not enough to be American only in the eyes of Lords, and it's not enough to be only half American and know that it is an empty half. Here, blood ties and filial piety, place of birth and military draft, both the family and the geopolitical, both the destined and the coerced, are helplessly correlated with national identity. In other words, above features are only meaningful insofar as determinants of Japaneseness or Americanness. The last quote shows how American operate both as a given and a becoming. At one hand, one is simply American enough through the place of birth. At the other hand, one has to fight for this place. Similarly, the previous line also illustrates Japaneseness as both a given and a becoming. At one hand, it's simply determined by the ethnicity of one's parent. At the other hand, the Japanese American helplessly becomes Japanese again, not by fighting for Japanese, but merely by not fighting for America. It is just this very exclusiveness of the second set of features, the nation, that makes the third set of features, such as personal memory and decisions, an absurdity. Thus, we may infer that the emptiness lies not in Ichiro's rejection of the army draft, but how he attributes both the motives and effects of his rejection to national sentiment. He rejected because he did not love America enough, and that he is now doomed to suffer from shame and guilt. In addition to his perception of self, Ichiro's description of his mother and brother also exemplifies self-allegorization, for that he sees them not only as self-identified Japanese and Americans, but also as embodiments of national sentiments. In other words, they are initially described as extreme flat figures whose sense of subjectivity is composed purely of national identity. Now moving on to the plot development, the complication of allegorization. So if chapter 1 illustrates Ichiro's act of self-allegorization, as the following chapters work to problematize this act. So through encountering Freddy, an old acquaintance and also a no-no boy, Ichiro remains helpless but also becomes somehow relieved, as Freddy's sense of irrelevance implies that the neither nor dilemma is to some extent neglectable. For instance, quote, "You and me, we picked the wrong side, so what? Doesn't mean we gotta stop believing." While this quote does not negate the existence of a binary-like formulation of national identity, it does critically discredit its effect. While Freddy offers a potentiality to ignore the Soul Nation allegory, Ichiro's best friend Kenji would complicate it. As a former World War II soldier, Kenji is supposed to represent a patriotic Japanese American. Just as Ichiro first meets Kenji, he expressed an almost morbid sense of envy. For instance, quote, "Kenji could still hope. A leg or more or less wasn't important compared to himself, who was strong and perfect but only an empty shell. He would have given both legs to change place with Kenji." Through this quote, we may observe that at this point, Ichiro is still immersed in the Soul Nation allegory, in which the body is simply neglected. It is separate from the soul. The injury does not matter as long as one is mentally whole. However, Kenji soon shows Ichiro that the soul and the nation and the body cannot be simply divided, that the injury and experience of war have made him equally disillusioned. For instance, quote, "Talking about it doesn't hurt. Not having it doesn't hurt, but it hurts where it ought to be. Sometimes I think about killing myself." Interestingly, as a doppelganger of the protagonist, like the other side of the coin of the protagonist, Kenji is also initially envious of Ichiro. However, when they meet the second time, Kenji no longer wants to change place with him. For instance, quote, "When it comes to the last half of an inch and it starts to hurt, I'll sell the car and spend the rest of my life sitting here with a drink in my hand and feeling good." Here, the phrase "feeling good" suggests that Kenji has recognized the real problem Ichiro has to solve. It's not necessarily his no-no boy identity, but a guilty mentality. For instance, quote, "Don't blame yourself, you're killing yourself." As Watkins observed in Black Power, Yellow Power, and Making of Revolutionary Identities, it's Kenji's willingness to critique his own choice that enables Ichiro to begin his howling. For instance, Kenji not only remains extremely calm when Ichiro tells him that "I'm a no-no boy," but also makes affirmation that yes boy identity equally problematic. For instance, quote, "They gave me a medal, a car, a pension, even an education, just for packing a rifle. Is that good?" In addition, Kenji is also critical of his fellow folks, namely the other Japanese American veterans. Kenji believes that they do not have the right to abuse Ichiro, and behind their verbal abuse lies an expression of fear and confusion. For instance, quote, "The guys who make it tough on you probably do so out of a misbegotten idea that maybe you're to blame because the good that they thought they were doing by getting killed and shot doesn't amount to a pot of bean." This quote is significant because it not only exposes the inner conflicts of the veterans, but also suggests that the participation in the war does not grant one recognition and belonging. Thus, when the old soldiers spied on Ichiro, we may argue that explicitly they are bitter about Ichiro's lack of patriotism. However, implicitly they are bitter about the American government. And now moving on to the last part, the ending of the novel. So while Kenji is wise enough to see through both his Ichiro and the old soldier's mentalities, the resolution he gives are not without faults. For instance, quote, "Go someplace when there's isn't another Jap with 6,000 miles. Marry a white girl or Negro or Italian or even Chinese, anything but a Japanese. After a few generations, you got the same beat." As observed by other scholars, while this quote expressed hope for social and sexual relation, there's also a reverse essentialism at heart of his abomination. Although Watkins concluded that Kenji sent Ichiro out to continue the journey to self-definition, I would like to argue that at the end of the novel, Ichiro chose another path of self-definition and reconciliation, which does not require alienation with one's own race. Such an alienation is fundamentally an internalization of racism. By the ending chapter of the novel, Ichiro dances happily with Amy, who is also a Japanese American. Apart from the very publicity of this action, such as dancing in the pub, their dialogue also exposes the inadequacy of national and racial allegorical thinking. When a stranger at the pub insists on buying a drink for them, Ichiro first assumes that the man had a lot of Japanese friends, then assumes that he's also a Japanese who doesn't look like Japanese. Nevertheless, Ichiro finally tells Amy that "I want to think that he saw a young couple and liked their looks and felt he wanted to buy them a drink and did." Amy then replies that "you keep on thinking that." In short, we may argue that while both Kenji and Ichiro...
Zifan, you have 4 more minutes.
Oh, thank you so much. Both Kenji and Ichiro express hope for pluralism. The relationship between Ichiro and Amy suggests that the true resolution lies not in renewed social network, but in renewed perspectives. Although Ichiro's mother insists that Japan has won the war and eventually become mad after Ichiro's father revealed to her letters from their relatives in Japan, by the end of the novel, Ichiro no longer sees her as an allegory of Japaneseness, but a woman who also had youth and happiness. Her national sentiment is not a given from Japan, but very much emerged as reactions toward Americans' isolation policy. For instance, quote, "Was it she who was wrong and crazy not to have found in herself the capacity to accept a country which repeatedly refused to accept her or her son?" Nor does he see himself only as an allegory of Americanness. He recognized that his brother's Americanness is merely an arbitrary product of timing. For instance, quote, "You are not better than I. You are only more fortunate than that the warriors found you too young to carry a gun." Apart from his family members, Ichiro also changes attitudes towards the Japanese American soldiers. He no longer envies them or hates them back. Instead, he began to see through their weakness and insecurities. For instance, quote, "Bo started to cry not like a man in grief or a soldier in pain, but like a baby in Lord, gasping hoarse." In response, Ichiro puts a hand on Bo's shoulder, sharing the empty sorrow in the hulking body. Here, the phrase "sharing the empty sorrow" suggests that the reconciliation between the no-no boy and the yes-yes boy is curiously made not through fulfilling but through recognizing a shared emptiness. Lastly, moving on to the conclusion of my paper. As one of the pioneering novels in Asian American literature, the significance of No No Boy has been interpreted in diverse ways. While most scholars have been positive about its political implications, Jin Qilin argues that Ichiro's changing attitude is a superficial shift in mode. I would like to argue that, while it is indeed a shift in mode, for instance, like the beginning, Ichiro remains unemployed. Even worse, he also witnessed the death of Kenji, his mother, and Freddy. Nonetheless, I would like to argue that this shift in mode should not be described as superficial. Instead, it is the mode that matters. As observed by Jameson, emotions are fundamental mechanism in construction of subjectivities. This true significance behind recognizing the vitality of the Soul Nation allegory is not having a cynical attitude toward the state. Instead, as we have seen in the novel, the recognition and sense of belonging Ichiro pursues does not lie in the state itself, but the people around him, his family, old acquaintances, and even strangers. Ultimately, the novel is about the opposition and reconciliation between the people themselves, thus two interpretives. By this, I mean a recognition that the self and the others are malleable thinking beings who are influenced by discourse ideologies, but never fully identical with these ideologies. If self-allegorization is to internalize an abstract one-to-one narrative between the individual and the state, and sees the concrete individuals under this framework, then an abandonment of allegorization is to leave this framework aside to search for something else between a person and his or her national and racial identity. I would like to thus conclude that this something else is what Ichiro envisioned as a glimmer of hope at the end of the novel. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Zifan, for your thought-provoking paper. I mean, it's got my mind buzzing. Your intricate analysis, engaging us on self-allegorization and its complexities. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about in question and answer. And thank you for keeping to the time. We now turn to our last, but not the least fascinating speaker for the evening. It is my honor to introduce Ms. Ananya Bhomik. Ananya, are you there?
Hey, hi.
Hi, you're there. Great.
Yeah.
Ms. Bhomik is a neurodivergent and queer freelance pop culture journalist and independent scholar. She received her MPhil degree from Jadavpur University, Kolkata in 2022. Her areas of research and academic interest focus on and around Canadian Indigenous and diasporic history. The trajectory of the trickster across literatures of different cultures, queerness in media, and fandom studies. Tonight, she too will speak on different aspects of discursive diasporic silence, and her abstract of her paper to me reads as poetry. In her abstract, Ms. Bhomik writes, I quote, "The stories of a different people echo the silences of the hapless fisherfolk who were dragged inland away from trails that spelled survival. Their storytellers were silenced. It was game of silencing, but ideas tend to have a way of getting out. Thus, in the beating heart of the silence, cultures that are not at all similar to each other connect together in remembering, mourning, and healing, finding their voices in songs and poetry." The title of her talk tonight is the one about the Kyoto child, how Crickster, son of Eden Robinson, echoes the silence of Hiromi Goto's The Kappa Child. We cannot wait, Ananya. Please go ahead. Over to you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I feel like must share an odd thing that just literally happened, even though it bears no connection to my paper. I just received an email from Singapore Airlines going that I could avail a hefty discount if I booked tickets to Japan today. So I'm both creeped out and amazed right now. Anyway, the title of my talk today is the one about the Kyoto child, how the trickster son of Eden Robinson echoes the silence of Hiromi Goto's The Kappa Child. It is like every other academic paper, I suppose, like it's a work in progress. There are gaps I still need to fill, questions I still need to ask. So this is less of a paper and more of an excerpt for now. I'll begin with a simple yet favorite quote of mine. Hiromi Goto, in the very first page of her novel, The Kappa Child, writes, Kappa wa hontou ni iru ni kana? Sorry, Kappa wa hontou ni iru no kana? Wakaranai ne. Which kind of translates to, does the kappa really exist? I wonder. I don't quite know. And so begins a tale one cannot and should not with ease forget. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. In the wild and unforgiving lands of Canada, where the night is long and cold, survival is a question many have sought to answer time and again. In the chilly arms of this land, silence grows with a grim perseverance, running like a tapestry below the ground, threading through communities, connecting them in loops and beats of remembering, of pain and of resistance. In the beating heart of this silence, cultures that are not at all similar to each other connect together in remembering, mourning, and healing, finding their voices in songs and in poetry, in the tales of their people, once forcefully silenced, and only now slowly waking to the sound of their own hearts, and that of peoples so much like themselves. Slowly but surely, they are letting the singing lead the way back home. Once upon a time, when the swallows discovered Canada and its native inhabitants and decided to claim the land and resources for their own, it became necessary for them to get rid of the rogue elements. They quickly realized that the natives would not just vanish into thin air just because they wished them to. Thus began a very systematic and well-planned dismantling. Similarly, in the year 1941, the Canadian government began playing a different but quite similar game with the different people. They unironically called it evacuation. They called it preservation, protection, the words ringing like clanging metal in the ensuing silence. When the Japanese government bombed Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the government of Canada decided to prevent any attacks from the inside by rounding up the Japanese Canadian families living in the coastal areas and moving them inland, cutting off their only source of livelihood, the sea. From the December of 1941 to April 1949, when the restrictions were lifted and ever since, the word evacuation has, to the Japanese Canadians, become synonymous to exile, to trauma, and with the ensuing silence that we see ringing through the tales like that of Joy Kogawa's Obasan. It was a game of silencing, but for a different people. The teller of the story is silent, the trauma swept under the rug, but ideas tend to have a way of getting out. You have to remember, you are your history. If you cut any of it off, you are an amputee. Don't deny the past. Remember everything. If you're bitter, be bitter. Cry it out. Scream. Denial is gangrene. Writes Kogawa in Obasan. When Joy Kogawa's Obasan came out in 1981, at a time when the question of redressal was a hot topic for debate, soon to be followed by new Prime Minister Mulroney's promised in 1984, the politics of the book, while full of undeniable truths, perhaps still remains secondary to his sensibility and the need to define a relation and a distinction between the Canadian and Japanese way of looking at things, and somehow integrate these completely different perspectives into one beating whole. In Naomi and Emily and Obasan, and through the stories often unspoken of their lives, Kogawa explores the silence that came with and after the internment of the Japanese Canadians in the wake of the Pearl Harbor blast. Labeled traitors, having lost all access to land and livelihood and drowning in the shifting waters of a forced silence, the plight of the Japanese Canadians during and after the internment remains not much different from the tale of their neighbors, bound in reservations and in residential schools. There is a silence that cannot speak. There is a silence that will not speak, comments Kogawa again in Obasan. There is also a silence that connects and transforms, and sometimes it heals. For Naomi's Obasan, her silence is her grief. For her Aunt Emily, It is something to be refuted, to be reclaimed, and to be destroyed. And out of this writhing, teeming conflict, this forceful silence and the battles that rage against it, rises the trickster. We meet him in Hiromi Goto's The Kappa Child. He's the green of rice paddies and of shifting waters. He's the promise of life and remembering. Here, he's Kappa, the water goblin, a dish-shaped dent on his head and his pockets full of mischief. Much like what Kogawa does in Obasan, Goto's Kappa Child is an exploration of what unites and what separates the Japanese from the Canadians. This book, much like its protagonist, carries Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie in its pocket, comparing the plight of the protagonists of both tales, taking each of their fevered dreams apart at the seams and pointing out why what was possible for Wilder's protagonists are but mere fantasies to the four sisters in Goto's book. Goto's protagonist and her three sisters are moved from Colombia to Alberta when their abusive father decides that he'll try and raise rice in the prairies. But water is scarcer than hope in the inhospitable arid lands. Thus, the violence increases and the unnamed protagonist is left to wonder if Wilder's characters too heard the sounds of abuse in the night and chose to sleep through those intense grasping and clutching sighs. Her life, thus, is intricately connected to water, to its lack, abundance, and its healing. And when she finds herself in the arms of a mysterious stranger and becomes pregnant as if almost by magic, water is also remembering, hand in hand with her Kappa child. The protagonist is a collector of abundant shopping carts, their uselessness clanging and clanking in the back of her van. She said, the Goto goes, the solitude bleeds into my body, and instead of feeling lonely, a bubble of singleton glee swells inside my chest, claims the protagonist as the clanging of the empty carts reach a crescendo. A shopping cart is worth only as much as the contents of his belly. The narrator remains empty, unlinked, unhinged, much like the shopping carts in the back of her truck. The bleeding solitude that fills her with a cynical glee, the answer to her repressed memories of an overly optimistic father who left her with a dearth of love and of water. Water is a source and water is the end. Kappa lives are seeped in our understanding of this bond. In pools, quiet shaded in the forest deeps, in trickster rivers where children are received, in cold cavernous lakes from which the mountains grow, Kappa know that Kappa life is bound to water, writes Goto in The Kappa Child. It was water where it all started. When her people were taken away from the touch of the Kappa in the year 1941 and forced to stay away, they had not only lost their livelihoods, but their voices. And now that story comes full circle. The dearth of water had kept healing and love away from the children of Kappa. Now they must find their way back to it. With her magical Kappa child, thus, the narrator's story is one of coming of age and of coming home and making peace with it. Her journey from listless cynicism to understanding her past and finding her family and reconnecting with it. If this is a story of the Kappa child, it is also the story of the narrator, with her love of cucumbers and her memories tinted green with water and rice paddies. The connections run deep enough for us to understand, to question if we had met the trickster of this tale long before we knew it, a trickster with a penchant for collecting shopping carts and eating cucumbers. With her child in her belly, she is the one who returns, who builds bridges and who tells the stories of reconciliation, flitting from the garb of narrator to mediator to the keeper of the green kiss. Replenished rather than being depleted by her pregnancy, the protagonist revisits old memories and grounds and attempts to transcend the physical and mental bounds that her abusive father had forcefully instilled in her dysfunctional family. Goto's ironic and humorous narrative takes the alienation and silence faced by four terrified Japanese-Canadian siblings and comments on what it is like to grow up in this unforgiving land that won't offer the healing touch of water interspersed with mythical tales of the Kappa, he who blesses those who dare to believe in his magic. The Kappa child brings reconciliation to the stilted life of the narrator and the protagonist, and she is forced to check her memories and what she knew as facts about her childhood and her family. The narrative shifts voices between the present and the past and the fantastic, interspersed with almost philosophical questions about life, water, growth, birth, identity, and green, all told and asked as if by a mischievous, omniscient narrator whom we cannot quite locate at any point during the book. Like the tale of any trickster, things are never what they seem. The Kappa is a gender and belly button and less presence. The silent and seemingly subservient mother is an alien abductee, and her silence is loud and full of defensiveness. And as the protagonist builds the bridges that she believed to have burned down, she realizes her own fallacies and stitches the loopholes in her memory with her sisters, who turn out to be less damaged and spacey than she imagined. To quote Goto from the Kappa Child again, knowing that being grown up was no swell place to be means that you're already grown up enough to notice, and you can't go back from there. You have to forge another route, draw your own map. So the protagonist does, build her own map, that is. Unlike what it seemed in the beginning, this is not a gritty, cynical tale of loss. Instead, the bittersweet sense of loss permeates the hopefulness that the Kappa child introduces to the long silent ones. It is a tale of healing and love and finding one's way back home to the sound of splashing water and the quiet scent of the rice paddies. Trickster, goes Robinson in Son of a Trickster. Trickster, you still smell like lightning. From the water of rice paddies, the trickster takes flight to land softly with a caress and a loud laugh as Widget in the world of Eden Robinson's trickster's child, Jared. And here again, he walks the edges, neither here nor quite there, as Robinson weaves myth into reality. The son of the trickster, although not quite aware of his identity, at least for 2/3 of the first book, Jared walks nowhere lands with pride and with precision. In the town of Kitimat, silence is loud and chaotic. Many things are said, cursed, vomited, but none of it does much to dispel the sense of listlessness and lack of direction that colors most of the first book. Everyone, the author claims, knows a Jared. He's the teenager that does drugs, sells brownie cookies, keeps cool. He's the image of the good-for-nothing drunk native stealing welfare money to feed his drug habits. But the same Jared pays for his father's rent, albeit without his mother's knowledge. He takes care of his drug addict mother, looks out for his neighbors and his young sister and her baby. His life, at least at first glance, is a walking, talking stereotype. The women in his life are fickle and not very wise. One of his nanas does not trust him, calling him trickster slurs. The other nana is ever absent. His mother, an apparent witch, is addicted to drugs, violence, and changing partners. His young sister has a baby. His father does not work and is addicted to morphine. Their family is broken, to say the least. But he brings his stereotype full circle by selling pot brownies and waking up drunk every day. But the drugs are a gateway. They let him see things that others quite cannot. Talking ravens, vicious otters, and lightning aliens that buzz over the head of this wild child of a girlfriend. of his wild child of a girlfriend. Jared himself often walks the precipice between life and death, myth and real, and his sense of crisis intensifies throughout the book. The crisis itself reaches a crescendo when he cannot stop seeing animal spirits shifting beneath skins, even while sober, and resolves itself in the form of a realization. He is a trickster son, the widget feathers of a shape-shifting father curling beneath his skin. He is a witchling, the magic of his mother roaring through him. He is both and he is none. He is a bridge that spans generation. The wisdom of grandmothers and witches and the shifting morals of a trickster that shows the way by being the bad example, the example of what not to do. By combining native oral storytelling tradition with the West's dependence on written discourse, Eden Robinson thus creates a trickster narrative that pulls no punches, does not try to dispel stereotypes. Her laughter ringing in the face of stunned silence, her characters violently puking slurs and weaponizing the language that the colonizers are so proud of. This is a history of exploitation, of loss of voice and culture that Eden Robinson offers the readers through the experiences of a trickster child. Robinson's story makes use of a certain characteristic of the trickster, his tricky moral code, his sharp sass, to represent a history of exploitation, of loss of voice, and of trails that lead home. So begins Robinson's tale of Jared, a little crooked, a little wicked, always a little hard to understand, but with a laugh as infectious as his creator, a laugh that rings like feathers and smells like the rain-soaked green of the trail that leads the way back home. In her preface to The Sojourner's Truth, Lee Maracle had talked about how the reader becomes a trickster, the architect of great social transformation at whatever level you choose. And she and her many sisters were as lost as many of their peoples. So her words are directed as much as at herself as the reader, as she slips from the garb of the teller of tales, the mediator, to the listener herself. The writer thus becomes the reader. The writer becomes the Kyoti, becomes life, water, and kappa.
Ananya, could you have 5 more minutes, okay?
All right, I mean, you will wrap it up. All right. As such tales come trickling out from the throats of the once forcefully silenced, the system of knowledge shifts. The trickster hands over their mantle. The weird becomes the writer. The wisdom passes on. It is like Lee Maracle claims in her poem Performing. It is a performance. They forced one to forget, forced an alien tongue down one's throat. So when their backs are turned, she performs. She takes their tongue and makes it a weapon. Home was the silence of not knowing how it all came to pass, she says. Home is also finding out. What was lost in reservations and internment camps could not and will not be swept under the rug anymore. But the trail of their people, their roots, lay ahead, and the trickster, with his many mischiefs up its sleeves, must lead them. Even if, much like Aunt Emily in Obasan, the new wise ones have trouble bridging the gap between tongues and reaching younger lost generations. But oh, will they try. And when their own tongues fall short, the Gothos and the Robinsons of the world will reach for the laughter held in wings and waters. They'll reach for a pen.
Thank you, Ananya, for taking us to the world of silences and silencing, and to the intriguing world of the birth of the trickster and adventures. Thank you all for a very rich evening. And now we hand over the mic to Professor Julie Banerjee Mehta for the question and answer session.
I would just like to jump in here and say, Roma, what a brilliant job you've done, because I couldn't believe that you've kept it so tight and yet so collegial. Thank you so much for being such a lovely chair.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure. And over to you for the question and answer session.
Harish, would it be all right? Would you like to say a few words on this panel, and then we'll move on to the Q&A, which I can take care of?
No, I don't want to say any words. I just have a couple of questions.
Okay, so you go ahead and shoot and make it quick so that we can hear polyphonic voices. Yeah, thank you.
So my questions are very short, and the answers can be very short, so we can get more questions in. So I'm just keeping it. I'm just going to ask 2 questions. One, not a question, it's just a query to Shoshana and to Zifan. So for Shoshana, what I have is so this idea of the post-human, how does that fit in with Japanese tradition? Japanese tradition being rooted in the past, I would imagine, governed by patriarchal, conservative ideas, And the post-human, to my understanding, is going beyond the human. So in a sense, the Japanese will spiritually transcend it already from their traditional standpoint. But if you're using it from the standpoint of high technology and AI and stuff, how does then that sort of sit with tradition? And then very quickly, I might ask my second question to Zifan is that, you've said that individuals are often too complex to be allegorized or shown under a specific framework. And then you talked about the loyalty or disloyalty that the Japanese immigrant has to his participation or non-participation in the Second World War. I mean, that's just a comment. How to the character Genki, right? Did he have a sense of loyalty to either the home country that he left, or where his ancestry came from, and to the adopted home? Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, just briefly, like posthumanism breaks down the boundaries between the human and others, and I think Japanese philosophy historically already had that kind of breakdown in the belief in the Buddhist nature being in everything, and also in the perspective that spirit was in everything. So I actually think that traditional Buddhist and Shinto beliefs anticipated post-human philosophies, and it's almost like we've just kind of rediscovered those through science, in a sense, because post-humanism builds in a large way on theories of assemblage and the idea that all of these different parts work together to make up what is human, and that we're all systems working together. And that was already a part of the belief system. Technology is just an extension of that. Technology is the product of imagination, but also the product of all kinds of other things working together. And I don't think there's really a conflict with the Buddha nature or spirits being part of things that are made by humans either. It's not just something that applies to nature. And Buddhist philosophy and Shinto philosophy, they really adapt to what is around them. They're amazing that way, and in their kind of syncretism that, Western philosophy, especially on the religious side of things, doesn't have that kind of adaptive power, and thus it becomes irrelevant, I think, in certain ways that Buddhism and Shintoism continue to have a relevance because they're able to adapt, possibly.
Beautifully explicated, Shoshana, with a wide, with a wide angle lens. You've sort of covered AI and modern technology and bridged it with Shintoism and the spirit of the Buddhist beliefs of Tathagata, which really point to that spirit present in every creature, etc. Thank you. Zifan, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the inspiring questions. I think it's like to answer in two parts. So first about like the relationship between allegory and like loyalties. I guess like in my paper, the main idea of self-allegorization is to think that one's identity, one's significance is solely or only related with his or her national and ethnic identities, like the Americanness or Japaneseness. So for the protagonist Ichiro, because despite he has this like passion loyal for America, his rejection to participate in World War II made other people's and also made the government, the state, made everyone, including himself, to feel that maybe I'm not so patriotic, I'm not so passionate, and so thus I'm not American. But since he has already abandoned his Japanese identity many, many years ago, as he is like this kind of second generation immigrant, he kind of grew up in America. So he thus becomes this neither nor no boy for like the first half of the novel. And the second part of the question is whether this novel is all about loyalties or not. I think and if it's about Japanese loyalties or American loyalties, I think it's a very good question. It actually made me realize that I have cut an important part of my paper in order to save time. So actually in one section of my paper, I mentioned that through a dialogue with actually an American businessman who told him that it's okay to be no boy, Ichiro finally recognized that it was not his mother. It was his own sense of bitterness against the government that caused him to reject. So it's not even like filial piety towards his mother. For instance, in quote, I don't know, first they jerked us off to the coast and put us in the camps to prove us that we weren't American enough to be trusted. Then they wanted to draft us into the army. I was bitter, mad and bitter. I think this quote demonstrates that ultimately his rejection is not merely a byproduct of the conflict between his mother and the United States, but rather a reflection of his struggle against the government's coercion. So I think maybe the realization of the government's coercion also allowed him to kind of break away from the American-Japanese binary. Yeah.
Thank you, Zafran. Shoshana, go ahead, quick one.
Thank you for all of those talks. And I have a question for each of the other speakers, actually. Those are works I'm very familiar with and ones that I've thought about a good deal. I was really happy, Dr. Julie Mehta, that you spoke about The Road to Nagasaki, because I think that's a work that has been largely overlooked. And one of the ways that I've been really contemplating it is the sort of the revelations in that about the father's pedophilia and what that did to the family. And there's been connections made between that and Old Man Grover in Obasan. But because all of the Nagasaki part of the book was imposed later by the publisher and not originally there, I have really pondered whether the silence in the book, the darkness, all of that has to do with sexual abuse and not, and I mean, she makes the sexual abuse not a big deal too, which is this kind of further justification or excusing of her father. And yeah, I've wondered about that. And then for Ananya, very interesting connections between the Japanese tradition and the indigenous connections. And I also have pondered similarities, especially between the Dene tradition. But I hadn't made those connections between the trickster figures, and I love that. I was excited to hear about that. And I wondered if you were doing other work or had other things to say about the indigenous and Japanese tradition and connections.
Okay, so Shoshana, I would like to share, and I'm so happy you wanted me to unpackage this issue about the pedophilia, because it's no longer a secret. I mean, Joy has publicly, in recent years, talked about the fact that her father, who was a pastor, was a pedophilic, you know, and it was shocking to a very traditionally Anglo-Canadian audience to listen to her at this point where I heard the story from her. But you know, her other book, Ascending Rain, are you familiar with that? A lot of Old Man Grover's exploitation of Naomi, I think, is a kind of reliving that when she came to know about her own father's sexual trysts and his desires. And she says in conversation with us, just very informally, that it was cathartic. That's where and how strange that you point that out, because I think there was a line in my presentation where I talked about catharsis, and that is what I asked her, that do you feel it's a way of unburdening yourself of this huge burden that you carry? And it was not just about the Japanese internment or patriarchy from the national level, the Canadian patriarchy or the Japanese patriarchy, but she said, yes, it was very much a way in which she could tell the story of the grief of knowing that her father had really been a silent perpetrator of sexual assault and abuse. The other point I think that she made about what you're pointing at is that, and again, Snigdha, if you're here, you will understand why I'm so taken up by confessional literature. In a way, I think she speaks about her mother and how she remembered her mother and the trauma of her mother being impoverished completely from a very sophisticated woman who knew the opera, who knew Western classical music, who was really, she was an icon, a diva, really, to having to mend her stockings after she came out of the camp. So all of that, I think, points to what you are saying completely about the decimation, the driving this whole community to a kind of dysfunctionality, and the underneath all that very proper Japanese cultural fabric, there was a hidden danger of patriarchy in the form of Old Man Rover, who was really based on the figure of her father. I hope that answers your question. Anonna?
Hi, yes. So, thing is, as Julie probably knows, I'm very obsessed with the trickster. So,
We call Ananya in academic circles in Kolkata, Shoshana, we call her the trickster expert, because I think all the papers I've heard her read and create have been on the trickster figure in indigenous literature. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, somehow or the other, I have to sneak the trickster in. I literally have a trickster tattooed on my chest. Like it's a love affair at this point. So thing is, when I came across so I always, when I began my work on tricksters, it was mostly focused on Canadian indigenous literatures, and Genesee Armstrong's works, and the works of Thomas King, and especially interesting to me was it was a light bulb moment for me when I read the Republic of Tricksterism, right? How these narratives, these writers were taking these narratives and creating these narratives where the trickster was turned into a kind of a weapon, right? Like a symbol of resistance, because he is sexless, genderless, boundaryless. He does not stand for any morality. It does not stand for any, I say he, but then even pronouns don't matter here. He's beyond everything, and he can swoop anywhere, go anywhere. And I think at some point cultures, repressed cultures, in some way or the other around the world, because every culture, I think at this point, because every culture I explore, I see they have bunch of tricksters, okay, and it's understandable, right? Because every time there's repression happening, something slips out, something much like the trickster, something who looks very much like the trickster, who is not bound by any boundaries that these colonizers, these oppressors force upon people. So when I encountered the Kappa child, I was like, blown away because I was already exploring the idea of how the future rises out of silences, how repressed people. And Japan has this like thousands of tricksters. I tried to locate some, and like that they call usually like we'll just call them demons, but they are really not demons. They're all tricksters. They are literal pillow tricksters, blanket tricksters. There's kitsune. There's like thousands and thousands of them. You can't really like track any one of them. And these humanoid creatures and like animal, like some animal spirits. These are all tricksters that like that have colored their narratives throughout, like in the like well when they were creating the myths, and even now like in their anime, like for example like the kitsune figure is like a huge thing in the anime world, right? And also how the monkey king from the Chinese culture, like Sun Wukong, comes across and like becomes Goku, right? Like in Dragon Ball Z, flying in the clouds, and like like just like people, like once you start drawing this like similarities, drawing on the similarities, is just like the trickster is everywhere. Like I sound probably spiritual at this point. God is everywhere, but like yeah, for me the trickster is everywhere, and I find it very very heartening that because the trickster for me symbolizes resistance. So this is something I try to explore with my other works also. I hopefully will be able to continue doing so.
Thank you.
I love how they're employed too by queer and genderqueer authors. Like I'm thinking of Larissa Lay too,
Yeah,
who brings
yes.
in the Chinese, and yeah, thank you for the
Any
answer.
kind of boundaries, they like the trickster is just like not one for them, right? So like it's the best.
Thank you both of you for that wonderful conversation. So shall we open up to the floor? Looking greatly forward to more questions. Who's first then? Yes, Shuranjana, please go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon, ma'am. Good
Very good
evening.
afternoon.
So I have a question. We talked a lot about silences in today's talk, and currently we are reading about mixed race immigrants and how they often dwell in a rootless situation where they are in the middle ground of two entirely different identities, two entirely different cultures, and their identities, they often question their very root, their very identities, and connecting this to the narrative style that is used in Obazan, where Naomi often breaks her thoughts. It's almost like a stream of consciousness, but not so. She's going back and forth and she's reflective. So, and also we talked about the silences. So, do you think this is reflective about her identity and her experiences of living as a immigrant or as a Canadian Japanese person in a situation where in a country where they don't really accept her, but again she cannot go back to her native land as well because she doesn't know enough of that culture. So that dilemma.
Shuranjana, I'm going to pass this on because you hear lots of my voice anyway. So I'm going to pass this on to Ananya and Professor Shoshana and Zifan. And very quick round robin to see what you would have to say. So Zifan first, please. How would you answer the question?
Oh, so you mentioned like how do they navigate or cope with the two like almost opposite. Perhaps one resolution or one possible reaction for them is to kind of come up with this third kind of identity that kind of merge or incorporate both, yeah, like for instance, American culture and their parent culture, and such, I guess, a mechanism could be termed as like some kind of hybridity. Or I think Liu Qing, a professor, mentioned the idea of radical consciousness or third consciousness that is different from, I think, Duvall's famous idea of like the double consciousness, that like the idea of having a radical one or like a third one may help to kind of cope, I guess resist or deal with the binary like obsessional framework. Yeah.
Superb, Zifan, because in our post-colonial context, we're always talking about hybridity being a good thing, you know. It's a good thing because it's a liminal space, and in a location of culture, for instance, Homi Bhabha is always invoked. So great start to that. Shoshana, what would you add to that? I'm sure your students ask you this all the time.
They don't actually. It's not something that I think comes up as much in North America as it does, let's say, or Canada as much as it does in Japan, because I think this culture already has so many different backgrounds as part of it. I think it more comes up with the like origin culture. Like I'll say I'm half Jewish, and I don't fit into either, but especially within the sort of more cohesive group of Jewish culture, that's where I really feel like the outsider. And I think that can be true also in sort of national identities that have a very strong national identity. Canada's national identity has already incorporated sort of the margins into the center. There's people that write about this, but I do see that difficulty as expressing itself more in countries that have more of a cohesive identity. Maybe it doesn't come up with students though, and I teach a lot of mixed race authors.
Yeah, funny you should say that, because at the University of Toronto, you know, our campus, downtown campus demographic is 70% Asian students. So we hear a lot of it, especially in post-colonial literature classes. So it's very interesting that in the same national setup, we have this difference. And one wonders how multiculturalism really will evolve. So yeah, that's interesting. Anana, how would you tackle that? Being very much a post-colonial scholar yourself.
I think, like, I don't think there can be a general answer to this. Like, this is the general experience that, like, people like the Japanese Canadians, or like, any like diasporic like mispressed people are having in Canada. Because I think the entire experience, like any kind of, when you're searching for your identity in like when you inhabit this in between space and you are searching for your identity. For example, I'll bring up my own example. I'm non-binary, right? So like, I technically inhabit the space in between masculine and feminine, right? So there are parts of masculine that I take in, there are parts of the feminine that I take in, and that's all like unique to my experience. I can't say that the next non-binary person feels or deals with it the same way I do. The experience differs by individuals, like, depending on their own experience, whether they are bullied at school, whether they escaped it entirely, whether their families were supportive or otherwise, whether their families tried to force them to learn English or force them to speak in Japanese at home. So a lot of things, I think, come into play and create this very individual experience for each of these people. And you can't just say like, oh, so this is the Japanese Canadian experience. Like, it's a like constantly shifting space, which is what I was like trying to talk about with Jared,
Yes.
like who is like the son of the trickster and the witch, which is basically a like metaphor for like, being mixed race, right? So like, there's like a constant line that you gotta walk and take what you are willing to accept and what you think will become part of your identity. There's like constant dialogue and questioning happening. There's not a moment of realization that, okay, I am this. So that's what I think happens for like, people, like, you can't really speak generally about this.
Absolutely. And that's why I think even the line that you speak about, that is shifting. That is not constant either. So yeah. So Roma, just 1 second. We've got Anushka, Hazra,
Yeah.
and then yourself. Okay, Anushka, fire away.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I don't really have a question, but it's an observation. We have been speaking a lot about silence, and it just reminded me of the conversations we had when we were studying partition in class. And one of the things that we talked about extensively was even though partition happened in 1947 or even the Bangladesh War of Independence, the stories are coming in just now. So it just reminded me how trauma affects not just one generation but several generations after that. So that's one observation I wanted to share.
Excellent observation. And if you look at memory studies today, and there's a lot of work going on at all the various Indian institutes of technology, and they all have memory studies and trauma studies institutes. And this is what peace and conflict is about. If you look at Marianne Harsh or any of the theorists who work on this, Kathy Caruth, it's generational trauma. So partition is very much that kind of experience where the Japanese Canadian, see, there are three generations. In Canada, we say the Issei, the Nisei, the Shinsei. So the Issei is the first generation who go to these internment camps. The second generation, the Nisei, don't want to speak about it. And the third generation, and I'm talking about someone like Keri Sakamoto, they are ready to excavate, they are ready to find out what happened. A student in my class, I won't give you her first name, Yamamoto, two of her uncles committed suicide after coming back from the internment camp. And this was shared in class by her. And the reason is because they could not stand the Anglo-Canadian environment after the internment, after the war, where there would be a finger pointing at them and say, oh, he's come back from the internment camp. He was in a camp. So, you know, the idea of shame, the idea of giri is very important in the Japanese context. Good question, Anushka. Shirsha and then Dr. Roma Bhattacharya. Shirsha, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. So I'll take it from Anushka's point. From that, we can also take in the idea of body as a site of conflict. And if we are talking about memory and body, we can also look at the fact that, ma'am, this is a question and also an observation to your explication that if we are looking at body and memory, and in your explication, as you pointed out that the grandmother found the body of the mother and it was mutilated, and how you brought in the idea of the abject, is it also that the memory kind of erases the mutilated body of the mother because it wants to remember something of the past? So the past, there are three bridges between the past, the middle, and the present, and the memory often tries to shun the middle part just to remember the past, which is brighter than what is in the present. So is it how memory segregates very often the things that happen?
Yeah, actually, you know, you have a point there, Shisha, because that's exactly what happens. You want to remember the glorious days of the past of either your family or your community. And that's where, if I remember, in a brilliant essay called, if any of you are interested in the point that Shisha you made, it's called Family Romances, and I still remember it's number 5. And Freud says that in the case of wanting to resurrect an absent father, you know, a father who was an alcoholic, who was a gambler, who was a womanizer, you don't want to remember that. You want to remember your childhood days. You want to forget the middle. And that's exactly what happens on a right in the communal experience. Even if you talk about green grass running water, you know, Thomas King, it's always, or who was that guy who wrote Karibu, the guy who wrote about the Métis culture, where there's a mixture of, it's not coming to my lips now. But yes, Shirsha, that's how it works, that you want to remember the glorious past and not what happened in between. So Shoshana, if you want to talk a little bit about that, or Zifan or Ananda, please go ahead and address the question. I think her question, Shirsha's question, is that In memory studies, we generally try to erase what is an immediate trauma and go back to a past which is glorious.
It does seem to me, oh, go ahead, Sifan.
Oh, go ahead first.
It does seem to me that it's the third generation in a lot of different traumatic situations, including I'm thinking of Holocaust studies.
Yes.
And you mentioned Kathy Caruth and that, I think, or Shoshana Feldman, I forget. But yeah, it does seem like there is a sort of a lot more interest in the third generation, but that the trauma continues through those generations. Yeah, just to briefly.
Great, yeah. Sifan?
Oh yeah, this is very interesting question. Actually, we just talked about like trauma and generational difference yesterday in like Chinese literature class, and we mentioned about like how the Cultural Revolution in China, like my grandparents, they actually experience it, but they kind of internalize it, justify it, feels like it's reasonable and everything. Whereas my parents, who did not experience the trauma but kind of like heard it from other people, and they just find it they're just being more critical and more fearful of the past. And I find that kind of situational irony quite interesting. And I guess it echoes with the idea that like it's the third generations who are more interested in figuring out what happened, whereas the first generations, they kind of just want to be silent about it.
Yeah. Ananda?
I like kind of have this feeling like there's also like the kind of distance that happens, right? Like, you know, when you have faced the trauma, you're looking more for relief, for stable grounds, right? For way to look past and hope and survive. Survival becomes more important than actually redressal, right? That like, you know, to actually survive the effects of trauma, like, because that is like, to them, the memory of it can destroy everything about their identities. But when there's a distance, for example, I'll give a very simple example. Okay. When, for example, like if I'm traveling somewhere with my friend and someone misbehaves with my friend will be much less likely to immediately say something. There will be a state of shock. There will be questions like whether, like, you know, in cases of abuse also, like, you know, there will be questioning, there will be self-doubt. But like me as the outsider who is much more protective of her and has a distance, okay, I can seek redressal in her stead. It becomes easier for me to seek redressal because there is that distance that happens. I'll like my mother will for example, like, will be much like more likely to repress her trauma than I'll be likely to repress her trauma. I'll try to speak about it, revisit it, try to maybe even seek vengeance or like some form of redressal.
Yes.
But she won't, because survival becomes the most important factor here.
Yeah, point taken. Dr. Harish, if it's to do with this, please go ahead and then we pass it on to Roma.
Yes, it has something to do with this. If you recall the years in the early 90s, when we used to visit Cambodia, they were just recovering from the genocide in which close to 2 million were killed by other Cambodians. As outsiders, we wanted justice brought to book. We wanted an international tribunal to try the Khmer Rouge. A tribunal was set up, but the government of the day, and the tribunal was composed of international figures, the UN, and that was, imposing a Western thing, or even a human rights thing, or even a logical thing that bring them to book. But the Cambodians would not see it that way. They wanted a Cambodian solution to their own problem, and which meant that let's turn the page. Now, I in those years interviewed, princes and politicians and former Khmer Rouge, current Khmer Rouge, and they all said, if you're going to hang these guys, what will it do? Will it help us in any way? Because it's all happened. So let's bring them all in. And that's exactly what Hun Sen did. He organized this amnesty for all previous genocidal figures, almost like, you're organizing an amnesty for, say, Hitler's boys, his gang. But in Europe, it wasn't conceivable or possible or logical or done. It wasn't. But in Cambodia, they were brought in.
But you've opened. Sorry, Harish, you've opened a can of worms.
Yeah, the worms.
Sorry,
the worms were always there. We never wanted. They were never. The cans were always open. We just never wanted to see these guys. And,
but how do you answer the question? And this is a question for.
It's about the Western human rights model versus this. I think Eastern forgiveness. It's just crazy.
But
you remind me of Michael Ondaatje's Anil's Ghost.
Yes.
That whole discussion of that model. It's just, that's the discussion.
Yeah. And how do you answer the question then, as a historian, Harish? In Hamilton, which is where your university is, McMaster, I have students coming to my class who say that they are so wary of the Cambodians 2 blocks away who might have killed their aunt or their grandfather. So when this Cambodian diaspora is in each other's face in a third and neutral country, then what happens to lived experience, trauma, peace, conflict? Anyway, I will let that be for now. Something to think about. Dr. Roma Bhattacharya, we've kept you waiting. Please go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think this evening is leading to many, many future sessions. It's such a rich evening. I just wanted to quickly talk about something which is, deeply engaging me at a philosophic level, which is that, we've been discussing diasporic discursive silences all evening. And I come also from a feminist background, and I can't help feeling the resonance of 3 things that were said from last evening and today. One was, I think, from Obasan, denial is gangrene. I mean, it is so powerful and it resonates deeply with also feminist literature. The other one, of course, is the primal wound, Julie. I mean, that primal wound, I can write a book about it. It is so profound, which Professor Ma talked about yesterday. And I think it resonates far beyond just post-colonial literature. It can, it's pretty central to feminist literature as well. And Anonna's surprising comment, silence connects and transforms. I mean, that leave me thinking for a long time, because I'm a very rabid feminist, and I'm not very sure when we are confronted with the primal wound. Yes, this allegorization of self and so many ways in which we construct and perform cells and thinking and ideologies in society. So we would like the silence to connect and transform. I mean, that's what the human condition, the purpose of this entire conference is about, the connection that brings us to the human connection. But there is a primal wound, and I'm a bit leave this evening with a sense of ambivalence that the two can come together. I just stop there.
Thank you so much, everyone. All the participants and all the speakers. And the last word goes to Dr. Harish Mehta.
Well, according to the program, the last word is with you, but the penultimate word is that I'm just very thankful that all of you came. You came from Canada and America, and Zifan just started a course. We wish you all the best. Yes, keep in touch. And Shoshana, nice to meet you. I'm glad you came to this conference.
Thank you. So nice to meet everyone here.
Yes. I don't know if Sheng Mema is still here, but I've been in touch with him for quite a while now. And it was nice to have Ananya and to have met Snigdha. Unfortunately, Chitra was very sick, and she sent her a handwritten paper, which I managed to read. So I think we've mentioned all of the participants.
Except Vivian.
Vivian was here a minute ago.
I'm Vivian. Yes, I missed Vivian. It was very, very interesting and enjoyable to listen to her paper. And finally, I thank you, Roma, for acting as an excellent chair, and all your years of experience have come through so nicely. All your
Thank
years,
you.
your years in the UN,
Thank you so much. It was an honor.
Yes.
It was an honor. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Julie, thank you for starting this literature conference series, because this was something you wanted to do, and we were so happy to have this as a part of the journal. And so, which interestingly would make the journal, not just hard stuff, but it be fully rounded, which is a change from most of these journals that tend to be so focused on war or peace or something just economic. So, but we, like a good magazine has, it has a beginning, it has a middle, it has book reviews, it has film reviews. So we've tried to do that, and I'm not sure if there are many journals that do that kind of thing. So I'm glad we are still young. We are in our second year, and starting our third year in January. So we're all looking forward to having this conference again next year on a different theme. The themes, of course, will always be around Asia, because that is what we are, as we say. I don't like the idea of niche, because every marketing man and his aunt talks about niche areas. So the niche areas, we have our niche areas. You can't be everything, we get articles about many times about Africa or the Afghan war. We don't have any expertise in those areas, so we decline politely. We've had writers from China, students from Tsinghua University, universities in Qingdao, Shandong. We've had scholars from Cambodia, Singapore, University of Florida, and Canadian universities. And we continue building bridges with them. We continue engaging with them. And we continue alongside the journal's publishing program. We continue publishing proceedings of conferences. And so we are going to be looking into that very soon. So you can all expect to hear from us in that regard. So that's it. Thank you once again to all of you, and over to Julie.
Well, Harish has really rounded up beautifully. It's actually an honor to have had this kind of collegial atmosphere. You've all created it. Shoshana, I have such wonderful memories of your part of the world in Canada. One day we will meet and we will talk.
I have wonderful memories of India.
Oh, wonderful. There you go. Even more to talk about and negotiate on. So I especially want to thank all the participants from yesterday and today. And I think the exciting thing is that it is Harish's doggedness, for lack of a better word, his persistence for excellence, for meticulous editing, that we have this Michael Ondaatje conference literally morphed into a beautiful book, an anthology of essays from the proceedings last year. I'm really excited about that, hoping very much that he will be as persistent and as, cracking the whip at us to get things ready on a piece of paper. So Zifan, Shoshana, Anonna, myself included, I think the next lap is to get cracking on a paper that can be published. Yes, Rohini Chakraborty, what a pleasure. You have something to say. Go ahead. Rohini is from the media.
Hello everyone. Yes. I just like to share that it's been a wonderful experience, a very new experience for me, and to meet such wonderful intellect people. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
You've been here pretty much on both days. That's quite wonderful. Well, the day is moving along in North America, and the night is moving along in this part of the world. So I should not really keep any of you. My last word of thanks is to Mohini on behalf of Dr. Harish Mehta and myself, and to Harsh Kumar Singh, who are techie wizards and have kept it going. And we look greatly forward to being in touch with all of you. Thank you, participants, and have a wonderful night. Good night and good morning.
Thank you, all of you.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you, Roma. Goodbye.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye.